And we are back with David. Welcome back, David. It's good to see you again.
Likewise, thank you.
So, last time we spoke about a week ago, you were working on some things around physical knee pain primarily. And we talked about several things that you could work on between then and now. What changes have you noticed so far happening, just even from the work that we did together or from the work that you've been doing between then and now? What have you seen change? What have you not seen change?
Yeah, so in terms of the physical discomfort side of it, the progress on my actual knees and how they feel are that the sort of spot treatment that we did a week ago together, that one super specific spot on the upper part of my left knee has not been a problem since. So for me, I'm still sort of a little skeptical about how this particular modality, which I very much believe in for other practices, works for physical pain sensation. But I have to eat a little bit of crow in terms of that one specific spot has not been a problem. And
Fantastic.
yes, yeah, very much good news. And then over the course of this past week and doing the sessions on my own, the easiest way to describe it is that my knees feel lighter. It's not an overwhelming reduction in like all of the sensations that are going on. I would say the pain is diminished, but generally it just feels lighter. To be specific about the language, the sensation in my knees is physical weight, not some sort of energetic reference. So that's been an interesting experience. I was walking around last night, sort of had trouble drifting off to sleep and was sort of just kind of pacing around, putzing around a little bit. And just while walking, I could tell my knees felt lighter. So just as a sort of, I don't know, sort of maybe more a random aspect of the physical sensation, but strong enough to note.
That's great. Very cool. And so that lightness doesn't necessarily equate to less pain in the other areas that you weren't focused on. It's more just a sense of like they felt kind of heavy or maybe more full or inflamed or something before.
Yeah, and so the question mark for me is I don't know about inflammation, right? So I don't know if like any sort of physiological change happened with it or if it's just the sensation. Either way, for them to feel light rather than heavy and sort of, how that can kind of lead to a feeling of sort of just, I don't know, heavy legs and sort of dragging around a little bit. It's been a refreshing change.
Yeah, yeah, good. That's great. So in between, I had a realization about something that we had talked about last time, and I sent you just a brief email to kind of update you on that concept because we had been talking about that kind of stubbornness or that tendency to need to stick with something even when it's not fulfilling or doesn't feel like your purpose or whatever. And you were kind of struggling to think of times when you were younger where that was the case. And what popped into my head was just this sense of like, our society kind of pushes that on people, like you're supposed to follow through with things, or you have to follow through with things, and you have to keep plugging away, even if you don't enjoy it, even if it doesn't feel fulfilling, like all of that kind of stuff. And so that I thought might be a piece of it that you might acknowledge if and when you do that round of, focusing on being stubborn here and now, how that looks and feels to you, and times in the past where you have felt like you had to, or that you should, or, anything of that nature as well, could have been included in that. Did that make more sense to you?
So in terms of like the email and what you sent over and everything that you just described here now, it all made sense. And in terms of my stubbornness, that was sort of the thing that I didn't really act on, right? So in terms of like, doing my homework, as it were, there are other topics that I did, and we can dig into those. And then that was the topic that I sort of shelved, and sort of when I described what I did do, it sort of sets up why I didn't really push to go there. And bluntly, that's what's sort of next on my ongoing self work of using PS Tech and what comes next
Hmm.
in general for me.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So what have you worked on so far, and what kind of results have you seen from those?
Yep. So I started off using the Belief Blasters tracks. I find those very easy to use. And so uh, changing the linguistic structure of the phrase to the past tense, I started with I had bad knees. Um, and, in terms of sort of trying on the phrase for size, right? Sort of saying it a few times, making sure that that resonates with like, that's the thing I want to do the session on. That all felt good. And then as I was going through the track, there was that telltale sign of my mind sort of letting it go and starting to wander a little bit. And that happens usually about 2/3 of the way through for me. And there's the notion of sometimes you start a track and your brain sort of fires off a different idea, a different phrase, and it's sort of, okay, stop, course correct, do that. But then when it is working and there's no course correction needed, I find, yeah, sort of the proof that like my brain is letting it go is usually after about 6-7 minutes. I can just sort of tell that like other thoughts sort of start leaking in, and it's sort of like the distracting thoughts, like if you're trying to meditate and sort of the whole thought kind of pops into the back of your head. And so I view that very much as a good sign that my brain's sort of letting go of the topic in real time.
Yeah,
So all
and what I usually have happen is either like the thought, the statement will start to disappear on me, like I can't even find the words, or the proof to the opposite kind of thoughts will start to come in. And sometimes, both with the click track and the belief blasters at this point, there's a point like partway through where I'll just sigh and I can tell that I've
yeah,
released it. So
yeah,
the more you use it, the more like stuff like that starts to happen. But I do think that sometimes when people start getting the mind wandering, it's either that it's starting to clear like that, or it's your brain showing you other things that are related to that thing. Um, and it just may seem like your mind is wandering, but really your brain is trying to help you out and go, here's another route, or here's another way that this is affecting you. So
all
yeah.
the associations. Yeah, yeah,
Yep.
yeah. And then for the second one, again, belief blasters, and the phrase was "I lost mobility." Um, Again, sort of making it past tense and all that jazz. And this one was really relaxing. I was doing it late in the evening before heading to bed, before going to sleep. I did it lying in bed. That's where I do a lot of the tracks, just sort of stretched out, relaxed. And that sort of sets up part of my fondness for using the belief blasters track is because I view it as so relaxing, right? I sort of view it as therapy in my pajamas, right? Because I'm sort of stretched out, I'm relaxed, and it's not super intense. It's not sort of ramping up the emotions for click track 2, and it's not the real kind of logic mind driven of cognitive behavioral therapy of trying to sort of find the magic linguistic structure that opens up a reframing. um, so yeah, it was just like relaxing and pleasant to work on the thought I lost mobility, which for me is its own sort of juxtaposition of that's like the least relaxing thought possible. And yet sort of lying in bed and like, yeah, it's like I'm just letting this go. Um,
That's awesome. And
yeah,
I think like as far as like the laying down to do this, it it varies from person to person whether that's okay or not, because a lot of people will fall asleep if they're laying down to do this stuff. And some people even fall asleep like when they're trying to do the click track, which I just can't even imagine how they're doing that. But some people just get into what most people would consider a hypnotic state and just get so deep into that that they actually drift off and fall asleep and lose focus on the thing that they're trying to clear. And, I mean, as long as you're able to make it through most of the track, a lot of the time it does work. But, it's important to stay focused on the thing at hand throughout the track. So for the people at home, if, if there's a feeling that you're going to drift off to sleep every time you try to do it laying down, then sit up or stand up while you're doing it. And,
Yeah, and
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I would say for not drifting off to sleep, I've found first waking up and heading to bed, right? And so, I mean, heading to bed, it's not about to fall asleep, but it's sort of, that time of evening of sort of relaxing and, turning off devices with blue light and sort of, brushing your teeth, relaxing, changing into pajamas. But that notion of kind of the first half hour or so of waking up and the last half hour before starting to try to fall asleep, I've found to be fantastic windows for doing these exercises. And then staying on that last one for another second, the I lost mobility one, my thought process during that was I was thinking of, thoughts of travel, getting on and off an airplane, walking through airports, sitting in a plane, you know, a little bit of the sort of thoughts of hiking, more so walking up and down my driveway. I have a long, curvy, high incline driveway. So just thinking of, mobility in the sense of physically walking and then sort of travel as sort of the two versions of that. And, not zeroing in on one specific mental image and just sort of letting them kind of flow through and just sort of different versions of, however my brain was thinking of mobility in general versus sort of more specifically walking. And again, that was just a really relaxing track.
Great, good. And just for the people playing along at home,
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the phrasing of belief blasters. And,
Mm-hmm.
If people want to play along at home, there are links in the notes to the show that show you, like they lead you right to my training module on how to use the click tracks and where to download them and how to use belief blasters and where to download them. So you can go and learn those processes for free. And then, of course, belief blasters and positive, those two cost money, but my training on those are also free. So people can go in and learn them. But as far as belief blasters go, the reason David's putting them in past tense is because you don't want to be saying a statement again and again in present tense. That's a negative thing. And the other piece too that I just want for people at home to hear is, the statements that you were using were a little bit on the short side. And typically he wants them to be somewhere between 7 and 12 words long whenever possible. So he would say, to put it like, I had the belief that I would lose mobility. So something along those lines to kind of make it a long enough statement. And that way you don't have to actually put the statement itself of like, I lost mobility. You could actually have that part almost be in the present or the future to some degree, because you're saying I had the belief that I would lose mobility. And that kind of allows for a little bit more of that play in, that future piece, while acknowledging that was a belief that you had and not necessarily that that's a flat out thing. But the way that you did it is another way to do it. He just suggests that it be a slightly longer statement. So just for people playing along at home, there's a slight difference between how people, state them and how people write them, but that's just the recommendation there. Oh,
Well, and that
and
perfectly,
one,
that's the next one. So one of the other topics that we had come up with in real time a week ago was the notion of bodies deteriorate as we age, right? And so I wanted to do something on that, but in terms of the phrasing, taking that linguistic structure and putting it in the past tense didn't really go too smoothly. And so I had a wonky phrasing for the syntax, and it was increased age caused bodily deterioration. And so this was one where like I had to sit and write it out. I had to write it a couple times. Like I'm looking at my own chicken scratches here, and I mean, yeah, I have like 3 different crossed out versions, different words crossed out and moved, things inserted. And this was one where, like, if someone had just said, like, if you had suggested to me that I do the exact phrasing of increased age caused bodily deterioration, I would have balked at how weird the syntax of that was. However, in going through and just sort of saying different versions out loud and working through it, what I found was that phrase said with kind of not quite like a sing-song incantation, but just sort of having a different inflection to it. So it was increased age caused bodily deterioration, and sort of going up and then cause as it's sort of the prominent word, and then sort of a downswing on bodily deterioration for the way I was just even just pronouncing it in my head, right? So inner dialogue still having that sort of inflection to it, sort of chunking it like that made it really easy for me to keep saying it over and over and over in my head. It totally worked. For me, doing that topic, right, the notion of confronting beliefs about age and bodies deteriorating, I had some resistance because there's a logic part of my brain that was like, no, that's what happens. Like, people age, and as we age, we deteriorate, our bodies deteriorate. There's sort of a reluctance to try and sort of zap anything that I think is just logically true. And sort of unpacking that for a second, there's the difference between turning off the broken record that's skipping and playing on repeat over and over and over versus running around, sticking your fingers in your ears and denying that the song even exists, right? So the notion of doing a topic like this with, what is it? I don't even remember, right? So increased age caused bodily deterioration, right? That's just to get those thoughts from stop hammering away in a neurotic fashion. It's not trying to change my belief about, like, at some level of like what I think happens with like biology or science. And so doing that really let it go, right? There was just, yeah, like turning down the volume on
Yeah.
all of them. And so for me, it was sort of a reminder of how, I don't know, sort of how the personal resistance factors flare up like right before you start to do something. Sort of, it's the last minute resistance sort of spikes, and it's like, this is one I could have easily given up on because I had to work through several wonky phrases, and I had that sort of like more logic side of my brain being like, but part of this is truths. But in working through it, then it was very much a release, and the more neurotic side of this being an issue for me is something that has subsided, and I haven't thought about it the past couple days the way I had, say, the previous 3 weeks.
Yeah, and that's the big piece with this, is just being able to stop saying things like that to yourself, continuing to program yourself with those kinds of things, and creating an expectation
Right.
of a furthering of that thing can be really damaging. So it does help to just turn down the self-talk around something like that. And, I
Absolutely.
mean, I do have a lot of people who like resist working on something because they feel like it is true. And whether it's true or not, it's like, if you are living under the belief or assumption that that's how it is, and you keep saying that to yourself and expecting that, then you're just going to keep creating that and strengthening that. and growing that more and more. And that's not something you want to cultivate. If it's affecting you negatively, you don't want to cultivate that belief or behavior anymore. So that's where this tool comes in very handy, whether it's a true thing or not.
Right. And so my sort of analogy is if it was a conversation with another human being, like it could be completely true, but eventually I would get so frustrated and fed up. It would be like, can we just please talk about something else now? And this is one of those things where using belief blasters on this, again, sort of wonky phrasing thing, let me have a different conversation take place in my own head. And so for that, I give it, big thumbs up and consider it very successful.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think probably like the way that I would have phrased it for myself, if I was going to work on that belief, would probably be more along the lines of, I had the belief that bodies deteriorated. No, I had the belief that age caused physical deterioration or something along those lines. Or I had the belief my body would fall apart the older I got.
Yeah.
Something along those lines. But it does help to some degree to have it worded in a way that makes sense to you, or that's similar to the way that you would probably say it to yourself. But so, sometimes with the way that he suggests wording belief blasters, it can get really tricky trying to figure it out. There's, some things I'll say, like, for example, I had the belief that vulnerability equaled weakness, something along those lines, where like you just, in order to draw a line between one thing and another, throwing in something like that can be helpful as well. So you could say, I had the belief that aging equaled deterioration. I think that yours was similar to that in some ways.
Yeah, and the notion of that structure of starting with I had the belief of that, for me, if I'm using that and then it's like a normal whole sentence, like that's fine, and that's probably the way I do it like 50% of the time, give or take, rough estimate. And then for the ones where it's not that, where it's not a normal grammatically correct sentence, I find it's like a really weird phrase just so I can, cycle through it as many times as possible while I'm listening to the track. And that's what it was for this one. I like the version of a full sentence that you just said, though.
Yeah. Well, if you find that it creeps back up on you, then you can always try that version instead. But if you're getting good success with this, then
Yeah.
you're good.
Yep. Yep.
So was there one other thing you worked on too?
Yeah, so I did a click track 2, and this was the one sort of combining in stuff with past moments and a childhood memory of sort of like growing pains and sort of more, it was more like shin splints rather than knee pain, but just trying to get back to something that happened sort of more formative years and all that stuff. And this one was interesting because despite this being sort of a present chronic condition and this being a childhood memory that I can, picture pretty readily in terms of ramping up the intensity, I could only get it to like a 6 or a 7. I don't know if it's because I've been working out for a couple of days or if it was because of the type of memory involved. In doing the session, I got it from like a 6 or a 7 down to a 2 or a 3. So there was progress and there was a degree of letting go. Overall, it felt less precise just in terms of like zapping a memory. And it was less anchored, it was less deep, it was less specific of a starting place. And after doing the session, I was sort of wondering how much of pain as a sensation rather than an emotion in a traditional sense was sort of at play with that, whether subjectively or regarding the modality. And then I did feel more relaxed. I did feel less emotionally triggered by thinking about all that stuff. So there's still that positive result. It just, it wasn't my greatest ever click track 2 usage, right? But after that, I had the intention of doing a 5th track. I had the intention of working on sort of the stubbornness and sort of this sort of broader stuff. And I kind of had that moment of just like, nope, I'm good. And I'm amused by that because in some way that's kind of the stubbornness showing up about not working on the stubbornness. So there's kind of a meta thing about that, which I find very hilarious. But there was also this notion of sort of like, I've blitzed this topic. I've done 4 things in a couple of days, and I felt good. And sort of, when you're doing the track, there's sort of that moment, and you said sort of, you kind of have that sigh of release during a track, and certainly had that with some of these. But then after doing this sort of week's worth of stuff, it was just sort of like, I'm good. Like, I'm just going to sort of take a pause, and like, that's that. In terms of then waking up the next day after all of that, it was sort of that reminder of, this was a daily practice for a long time. I actually looked it up in the past week, and it was 115 consecutive days. And the notion of sort of easing back in, maybe not quite that intense, but starting with sort of broader topics about like stubbornness and success as I go through sort of a transition with some work projects, and sort of getting that stuff back into the regular routine very much feels like a natural, organic step forward. So I think this was a great catalyst for ratcheting down some of the knee-related physical things, but then also kind of opening the door back up to being like, hey, like, why don't we work on some of the stubbornness stuff on an ongoing basis? And so in that sense, it felt like a very natural pause for where all of this was sort of bigger picture for, I don't know, my processor journey.
Great. Awesome. So it just kind of kicks you in the pants a little bit and has you ready to get back on track a little bit and get more things worked on and getting you back in the saddle, so to speak.
Yeah, I would say at the risk of splitting hairs, more back in the saddle and less a kick in the pants, which is wonderful because I think the universe does a great job of giving us very determined kicks in the pants some of the time. And it's nicer that this sort of felt more like just natural pacing and just sort of like, hey, the next thing to do, whether that's, the next week or, after the next trip or whatever, but I'll get to it. And it was good. It was a nice sort of reminder about all of it.
Perfect. Awesome. Yeah. And, I like to use the click tracks during kind of weird times. Like I would actually use it on the plane while traveling, or I think I've mentioned to you before that I'll do it, if something's bothering me in the morning and I don't really have time to like stop and do a click track, I'll actually play the click track while I'm putting on my makeup or doing my hair and complain about whatever it is that's bothering me while he's just talking at me, and, be able to kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone, so to speak. But I think to some degree it's just because I have used so many of his tools that for me, hearing his voice, my brain's just ready to let go.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's something I have not yet experimented with. That is awesome to just sort of have sort of the multitasking PS tech, if you will. I found one of the things that happened early on for me was after early days. So, several years ago, heavy usage of Click Track 2 on like the worst of my personal memories and experiences, and getting sort of, like some of the big boulders out of the way early on. I found if there was something going on, and like I can recall an incident of being stuck in traffic in Las Vegas and just telling my brain, I can PS tech this later, right? And just telling my brain, like, there's no need to be upset. There's no need to like be neurotic now in the present moment. We have the optional solution to use later. and just telling my brain that, like, we do have a solution for later. I found that for minor things like getting stuck in traffic or being, cut off while stuck in traffic, like just telling my brain you can PS tech this later would then mean I would be calmer and more in the present in the moment, and then I wouldn't even have to PS tech it later because it was such a minor sort of infraction or whatever.
Yeah.
Um,
And it's funny
but
because I think you had mentioned that to me a while back, and I mistook what you said. And I was thinking that you told your brain, PS Tech this, and just like asking your brain to automatically kind of do it to itself without the track and getting
well,
results from that.
so that's what happened next, right? So then
Okay.
that became like I would be stuck in traffic because I mean rush hour in Vegas, but I would just like use PS Tech it as like an exclamation, as like sort of like almost like a defense response of just like PS Tech it, and then like, and so the notion of like when we get home we can PS Tech this got truncated down to just PS Tech it, and again for little things it was just a way of letting my brain let go of it in the moment. Um,
And I've experimented with that a little bit too, and I have found that on smaller things that it does tend to work. And the more you use these tools, the more, attuned to them your brain is, the more you unconsciously memorize them. So it's like you can request of your brain, hey, run this, and just clear it without me having to go do the thing. And certainly on bigger stuff, you're going to have to run the track. But the more you use it, the more attuned to it you are, and the more you'll be able to just tell your brain, clear this.
yeah,
We don't need to get wrapped up in doing hours and hours of this on this silly thing. Just clear it. Just PS Tech it for me. Yeah, I've seen some success with that myself.
yeah, and for me I think that's one of the things that kind of jumps out, like the notion of it being sort of a silver bullet solution for some of the things that any of us have been plagued by for years or decades or things like that. That alone is pretty magical to experience that. But then the notion of this kind of, I don't know what to call it, but almost like compounding effect over time of just all of the stuff that's just sort of cleared and not in the way, but then moving forward, having it as you can sit down and do the session for the big things that come up, but then also kind of building up your immunization against the little things to this better level, I found has been, I would dare say, just as impactful as getting rid of some of the big sort of, big boulders from personal past.
Definitely. Yeah, me too. And I
Uh,
find a lot of times, like, the stupid little everyday things that bother us can lead to pulling up some huge roots.
right.
So if you can examine, like, okay, this person on Facebook said this thing and I can't let it go and I keep focusing on it, and you can ask yourself, what is it about this that's really bothering me? And look at your history of when other people have pushed similar buttons and clear that whole thing. It's magical, so you don't have to necessarily go looking for, the 5 major traumas in your life. A lot of times the silly little things that happen to us and trigger us can really point to some big things that need to be cleared.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think overall, and embarrassingly, I don't know how much we might have talked about this a little bit a week ago or not. The notion of when you clear the stuff that's recurring, you're freeing up time and space, right, in your head, in your life, like in your schedule almost, and just being able to just identify sort of social media is a great example, right? The things that come up that sort of we have these responses, and you just clear that at the root cause, and then it's just okay, like the things still are there, they still exist, but just to not fall down your sort of own rabbit holes of kind of that spiraling of the thought process. I mean, i I can notice the difference in my life of how drastically fewer things I find myself being neurotic about as my inner dialogue is different after having done rounds of this using primarily Click Track 2 and Belief Blasters. Positive Quantum Turbo I like and I recommend, but I haven't used it to the same degree as the other tools.
Yeah, I use it more of a spot treater because the click track and belief blasters are automatically putting in positives anyway. They're a little bit more generic of positives, but they're putting in positives nonetheless. So the PS Tech Positive Quantum Turbo to me is more like if you want to get really specific about
Yeah,
something you want to manifest or what you do want to believe or how you do want to behave or how you do want to feel, then you can get really specific with it. But a lot of times it's not even necessary. It's like if you can clear the things that are in the way of you feeling that way, then you just feel that way and you don't have to actually implant it to get there.
exactly. Exactly.
Fantastic. Well, I appreciate your update. Anything else that you want to share or bring up or anything, or are you feeling good with this?
I was to say, I think this is pretty much everything that we sort of touched on. I'm looking back at the notes from a week ago. Um, yeah, I think that's pretty much it for me.
Yeah.
But
So
thank you for
really
the.
the overall takeaway is the feeling that the knee pain that you've specifically focused on has been lowered or absent since we last worked on it. And also the emotional suffering about the
Yeah,
pain and possible debilitation has gone down significantly.
yeah, and in terms of just whether or not there end up being longer term impacts to health or mobility or any of that, I think all of those sort of external cards are potentially still on the table. It's just I'm not worried about it. I'm not suffering from an endless thought loop on those topics, right? So the those thoughts had really sort of ramped up over the past couple of weeks, maybe even 2-3 months, and then yeah, it's just sort of that delightful void of them not being there and me being. My litmus test for it is always like when I'm not doing something. So like when I'm like like walking in between rooms or whatever, like what are the sort of little thoughts that fire up like right there? And particularly with the knee pain, it's if I'm walking and I'm not already doing something, how frequently am I having thoughts of sort of being curmudgeonly about the state of my knees? And so for me, like the real litmus test is I'm walking around not being sort of negatively mindful, sort of triggeredly mindful of, what's the status of my knees and what's this sort of, unknowable future arc about what it means. And just to not do that negative future casting every time I'm, going up and down a flight of stairs is a delightful reprieve.
Absolutely. It really is. Yeah, I've noticed that for myself too in a lot of ways. And going back to what you said earlier about this like clearing up time and headspace. It's
Yeah.
just like we spend so much time worrying about things or replaying stuff that doesn't matter and all of that. And so this kind of negates all of that and gets that out of your way. And I have noticed that the more of this work that I've done, the more I've just been able to be in the moment, focused on whatever it is that I am doing or whatever's in front of me, instead of, I'll typically before if I was out paddleboarding or at the beach or doing even things I enjoyed doing, I would have still been thinking like, why isn't this happening in my life, or what if this happens, or why did that have to happen, and how could this person say this to me, and like constantly all of this like ridiculous chatter in my head. And now if I'm doing something I enjoy, like if I'm out stand up paddleboarding, I am just stand up paddleboarding. I am looking at the water. I'm looking at the birds. I'm talking to my wife. I'm paddling along, enjoying myself, and without all of that garbage in the way. And I think that that's kind of what you're talking about too, with like just freeing up headspace to be more creative, to be more focused, and to just be able to be in the moment when it's time to kind of chill and relax a little bit as well.
Absolutely. And you just said sort of the magic word in one of the side effects that I've experienced, bigger picture, longer term, using the tools, creativity, right? So the notion of, if we assume our brains are kind of doing something a huge chunk of the time, the statistics that are sort of bandied about the internet these days are, 50,000 thoughts a day and things like that. If we're getting rid of the really crappy dozen thoughts that run on repeat, hourly or even more frequently than that, then it's, well, what does your brain do? What fills that sort of thinking time space? And I maintain doing sort of, the heavy lifting with these modalities a couple of years ago was probably one of the best things I've ever done for unlocking creativity, because the negative stuff was off the plate. It opened up sort of this bandwidth, and then what got populated in that space was, I'd say, like a 30% uptick in creative thought and being able to sort of, mix and match ideas and just have more thinking time for, constructive thought.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I think that we've said enough.
Yeah, it's
As we often do.
pain at this point, but yeah.
Well, I appreciate you coming back and updating us and sharing your progress so far. And, if you ever have any updates to send my way or questions or whatever, I'm here.
I appreciate it, and thank you for the opportunity to have these conversations with you. And thank you for being the person who introduced me to PS Tech many years ago. It's been one of the highest impact things in my life. Thank you.
Mine too. Thank you. My pleasure. All right. I will talk to you soon. Thanks for coming on.